Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us here today for this fantastic panel on You Need a Plan C. What I think is so interesting about that title is you can interpret it really in two directions. One is you need a plan C because plans A and B have failed. The other is you need a plan C and a plan B and a plan A. And I think in this environment where the trends that created the last cycle, globalization, plentiful workers, capital moving all over the world, are all reversing, that we all need to have a wide aperture and a plan A and a plan B and a plan C. And I can't think of any panelists who are more prepared to help us navigate both that near-term churn and the long-term turn of these trends than the ones we have here today. Gita Gopinath, the Deputy Managing Director of the IMF, Nandan Nilekani, who is the chairman and co-founder of Infosys, and the soon-to-arrive Martin Wolf, who is in such demand at Davos that he is actually, he said he would be running from a panel. Those of you who know Martin hope, like I do, that he just walks here, and we'd much rather hear his views than hear him having strained himself. So thank you very much. We'll have time for questions at the end and look forward to your contributions. But where I wanted to start was I came to Davos, read all the headlines like you did. Davos is gloomy, everyone's down. And what I have found is a lot of, particularly business leaders behind closed doors, are saying, I keep hearing about this downturn, but we're doing fine. And that businesses are actually doing okay. And I'm curious, Gita, do you think that it's time for us to relax into more optimism for 2023, or are there risks that we should still be keeping an eye on?
Thanks, and it's a pleasure to join both of you whenever Martin comes.
Good.
The world has gone through a pretty tough time, but don't have to tell you that. Last year was tough. I think the second half, especially when you saw energy prices shooting through the roof. That was tough for the global economy. So when we had our forecasts in October, what we said was there were many downside risks to the global economy. Growth would slow in 2023 relative to 2022. And it's still a tough landscape. So what's changed since then? What I'd say is that we still have a difficult year ahead. However, relative to October, I think we've seen some more resilience in the global economy. In October, it was unclear what the winter would look like, how tough the energy problem would be in Europe. It turns out that the winter has been milder so far, and gas storage levels are at in a healthy place. That helps. When we were doing our forecast in October, we had China that was still with the zero COVID policy. With the new variants that go around, we were seeing many more shutdowns and lockdowns, and that was slowing growth pretty dramatically in China. But then in December, there was a dramatic shift away from zero COVID. We're seeing infections go up, exponentially, but this thing can die out very quickly, and we can see a rebound into next year. So it's still a tough landscape. We have inflation coming down, and I think we've had a few months of inflation coming down around the world. We think headline inflation has peaked, but not the non-energy and non-food parts of inflation, which are more stickier and what central banks care about. I think there's still a lot more persistence in there. There's variation across countries. So if I were to say relative to October, what's different now, we will have our new numbers at the end of this month, January 31st. It will be in the ballpark of what we put out in October. But what's changed is, I would say, that the risks have become somewhat more balanced as compared to what it was in October last year. So we expect to see growth bottoming out this year, which means annual growth this year will be lower than it was last year. But it bottoms out, it starts improving towards the end of this year, and then further improves into 2024. So if you want to put a positive lining, and maybe one of the reasons why there is this hope that we might, maybe we are moving to a slightly more optimistic place, is the fact that, in October, that was the third time we had talked about downside risks and we had downgraded the outlook. And I think we're now in a stable situation, so things haven't got worse than we had expected, and that's a good place to be. And I think people are taking some comfort from the fact that inflation is coming down. They're taking some comfort from the fact that, China has reopened, and that feeds into the global economy in positive ways in terms of demand. But, there are risks in terms of inflation that come from it. And labor markets in the US and Europe have been resilient so far. And so we've got inflation coming down without seeing much of an increase in unemployment. I don't believe that can stay. I do think that we will see the increase in unemployment that usually comes with all the monetary tightening. The question is, how much will that need to be? And the sense so far is that, maybe it would be more of a shallow effect rather than a deep effect.
Thank you. I actually failed to introduce myself. I'm Karen Harris. I am a partner at Bain Company and managing director of our macro trends group. And I actually wanted to ask you, from a business person's perspective, we've seen the optimism because it wasn't as awful as we could have been where we are. But while we are distracted by recession guessing with our crystal ball, what do you think business leaders are missing from a technology change, from other investment opportunities in 2023 that you would like to see them put their eyes on?
No, I think, for some time, based on the conversations we've had around the world with chairmen and CEOs of companies, the uncertainty had led to some freezing of decision making and so on. But now I think there are a few trends that we see. One is everybody has understood the importance of having more resilience in the business. Now, resilience can take many forms. If you're in the business of selling in a retail thing, it could be resilience is having more inventory. So if the supply chain is disrupted, then you still have stocks to sell. If you're in the service business, resilience is about having more employees, because if somebody doesn't come to work, you can put somebody else. Or if you're in the manufacturing business, resilience is about having multiple options to produce, so that if one country is down because of COVID, you can make it somewhere else. So I think the notion of resilience is, becoming pervasive on all dimensions. However, resilience costs money, because every one of these steps, every one of these things actually is adding to the bill. And therefore, I think there are things we don't fully know. If the world's largest corporations focus a lot more on resilience, then I think it just makes the inflation stuff more sticky, because all of them are going to be trying to do all these things. That's one thing. Second thing is, I think on technology, I think COVID clearly showed that digital acceleration is here to stay, and companies that didn't have a good digital story were actually not in business anymore. So I think that's very well come out in all the boardrooms, and everyone is pursuing a very, very focused digital strategy. To execute is still complex, but they're doing that. And then, of course, all the new exciting developments in AI and so on, ChatGPT and so on. And I think what I see happening is many companies have postponed their technological upgrade. You go there and then you find out they're running a 40-year-old system for something or the other, and all the programmers who did it are retired to Phoenix.
Like COBOL voting in the US, just as an example, from out of nowhere.
So even the recent thing at the whole airline thing in the US was old code. That's all it was. So there's this massive old code where the problem has been deferred. And I think we have come to the point where we can no longer defer it, because it's really in bad shape. And I think the new tools of automation, modernization using AI actually now enable us to take some of these old legacy systems and modernize them at much less risk. So I think even as people are moving toward the future, they also are looking at how to get their act together on all the old stuff running around in the factory, in the companies.
So that's a continued investment. And just building off the point you made on resilience and that it costs more. We think about the world we're in, what costs more? Well, workers cost more because there are fewer of them demographically, or investments in automation cost more. Nothing has been more deflationary than globalization, right? It's a massive, outside of healthcare, education, the services, we've seen massive deflation. And now, while we are perhaps a little relieved to see inflation come down, it doesn't seem like we're in a place where it's going to land where it did before. And so I guess I would ask of you, Gita, welcome, Martin, what it is that when we look at you've written about geofragmentation. Where do you see inflation landing for this next decade, and how should we think about navigating that more inflationary world?
There are many scenarios one can play out over here because we really haven't, we don't know what form the geo-economic fragmentation will take. But before we run in that direction, I think there is a question of where we think inflation might land, assuming there is no geo-economic fragmentation. I think as long as central banks are able to keep inflation expectations anchored, which I think the major central banks have been able to so far, that will bring down inflation durably. And there's no reason to think that we're going to be stuck in a high inflation environment for a long time. As long as we win the fight and we don't give up too easily, we make sure we bring down inflation durably. I think the risks that the world faces, and what we saw in the last couple of years, was to do monetary policy in a world where it's not just that you have to worry about demand being too high or too low, but in a world where supply may be too high or too low. So this demand-supply imbalance and calibrating it has been a particular challenge in the last couple of years. And to the extent that we think supply shocks are going to play an important role in the next couple of years, I still think the energy markets are prone to, you could see another spell of prices going up. Climate shocks are affecting food prices in many parts of the world. There are enough disruptions that we haven't settled yet into a new equilibrium. So I think this task is going to get harder. That doesn't mean monetary policy can't get inflation right on average, but it might miss it more frequently than it has in the past, as opposed to be consistently below a particular level of inflation. So that's where we are in the absence of geo-economic fragmentation. If you have, on top of that, geo-economic fragmentation, of course, that depends upon how severe it is and what form and shape it takes. In this analysis that we've done, we can get estimates that are as low as 0.2% of GDP, depending upon how the world is fragmenting, how substitutable goods are from different parts of the world, to like 7% of GDP loss on a permanent basis, if it's much more dramatic. Now, that would be like wiping out the economies of Germany and Japan on a permanent basis, right? Those are very severe effects. The consequences of that for inflation, of course, is in this environment is that it puts higher cost pressures. We have, both households and firms would face higher cost pressures. But again, monetary policy can regulate the level of inflation that there is in the economy. It's just going to be harder, and it's going to be a world where then interest rates would just have to be higher to match this lower level of productivity in the economy. Just to kind of feed off of what Nandan said, which is, the world has moved from being focused on hyper-efficiency, which is what the previous form of globalization took, to one about building resilience to and robustness in your supply chains. That comes with a cost, but that would be a cost we should be willing to pay because we need to ensure that we can continue to function in this shock-prone world. The risk is if we go off into every country going on its own, bringing production home, subsidizing your industries, going it alone, that's when you start shrinking the global pie. Now, you do redistribute. There are going to be some winners and some losers, but it's a smaller pie that you're dealing with.
Mm-hmm. So we've been joined by Martin Wolf, who's the Chief Economics Commentator for the FT and a very sought-after panelist and moderator. So I'm going to take advantage of the fact that we have him trapped here in this corner to say, Martin, you've probably had hundreds of conversations in the last few days. I'm
not that stupid.
Yes. As we were talking about the drifts that we've sensed in Davos towards more optimism versus the initial headlines, and I wonder if, as you've observed all the discussions, the fewer than hundreds that you've been in, what is the biggest mistake that you feel that we're drifting towards in Davos consensus this year, and how would you warn us against it?
That's a very good That's a very good question. I have been very careful to avoid too many meetings. In fact, I notice, one has to be careful of oneself. I noticed that we have the chief executive of the FT here, and I didn't go to our party. Why didn't I go to our party? Because at 9:30 I decided I needed some sleep. So, and this is my 25th Davos. So the way I survive is go to and have some sleep. The conversations I've had, well, some of the issues Gita was addressing were part of it. My sense of the sense, which is completely worthless because it's based on a relatively small number of meetings, is that people are absolutely desperate to be cheered up. They've had 3 pretty difficult years, so there have been some good things in it, and some of them have done quite well. The markets have tanked, which really matters to people here, though it doesn't matter to anyone else in the world, I promise you. And certainly not as much as here, as it does here. And that's really bad, and they want that to stop. And they have been very cheered up by the last odd figures on what's been going on, particularly in the US economy, which has convinced them that it won't be a very deep recession, and therefore we'll have a soft landing, and the Fed will soon stop this nonsense of raising interest rates, and the war at least hasn't got worse recently, at least not obviously, and the Chinese have opened up, so we're back to the races. Now, I think almost all of that's wrong, but I think they are too optimistic about what's going to happen to the US economy. I've had very extensive discussions here with 2 people who I take really serious on this, both Americans. I won't say who they are because I shouldn't. They were private discussions who convinced me that there's a pretty good chance that actually this ultra soft landing will not happen, that it is a serious mistake to think that the central banks. I've just finished a very long exchange with Philip Lane of the ECB, which I recommend if you want to understand what the ECB thinks. You may think they're mad, but he's very influential. And basically the lesson I draw from that and discussions I've had in the Fed is they will not, and I think that's the bet, let inflation stick above 2%. And many people will think they're not there yet. So I think the idea that central banks will come to the rescue of the markets in particular, which is a sort of mantra, is just wrong. They're more likely to over-tighten than remain, in my view. The mistake they're more likely to make is tighten too much rather than not. The prospects for China, I listened to Liu He, and we had discussions afterwards. I think China remains unreadable. The very behavior, to me, the behavior of the Chinese government over the last 2-3 months has made it more unreadable, and I followed it reasonably closely for 30 years than ever before. So I don't think it's easy to predict what is going to happen to that. I'm not even going to talk about the war because we really don't know. And there are lots of other wild cards out there. And the disintegration story, I've just finished moderating a panel for the WEF, that's why I'm late, on trade policy and the future of the trading system. And the principal speaker was the US trade representative, who was extremely articulate and made extremely clear that as far as the Biden administration is concerned, the priority is the interests of and welfare of workers, primarily in the US. And if that messes up the trading system, so be it. And I think one should take this seriously. I think they mean it. And if my attempts to get out of that some doctrine of how the World Trade Order should work, it was impossible. Now, I've never dealt with until Trump came along, I've never dealt with a US policymaker on trade, and I've been following them since the 70s, who didn't have a vision for the world order. So I think we should take that seriously too, and I won't even go where China is. So I think if the mantra is very shortly, everything will go back to normal, thank God. By normal, I mean before the COVID, or perhaps even before the financial crisis, but at least before COVID, I think people are seriously deluding themselves.
It's fascinating, that comment about the trade representative, because it sounds remarkably similar to what Robert Lighthizer said in the Trump administration. And we should take that consistency.
Well, I thought the most interesting thing she said, and that was really flabbergasting, because she talked about the USMCA, US-Mexico-Canada agreement, or is it arrangement? I don't know which it is. Whatever it is, as the model. And they pointed out that agreement was, admittedly with lots of pushback from partners, was negotiated by the Trump administration. And the really big point about that, which I think is extremely important, is that though the language objectives in some sense of this administration differ from that of the Trump administration, Trump was the brake. And there are very few areas where policy looks pretty bipartisan now. And one of them is China, and the other of them is trade. And it's not by the way accidental that it's trade and China. So the USMCA is the model. The core of the thing that is in the USMCA, there are many things, is lots and lots and lots of labor rights. And that was the price of getting it through, of course, but it's also accepted fully by Trump's people. So that's the trade policy of the US. And we know that's the trade policy of the US. It's a bipartisan policy. There's no chance of getting a trade agreement with anybody through the Congress, as far as I can see. The list of countries that won't be able to do it is very long. It starts with the UK. That's the environment. It's a different environment. Well, what it means for the world, all the issues you mentioned in terms of politics, economics, trade, inflation, that's another matter. But I think there is a hope that somehow this all will go away and we'll wake up from a terrible dream and fragmentation of these various kinds won't occur. But I don't think that's true.
So on that happy note, I have one last question for Nandan before I turn it over to you. So prepare, please, for your questions. Just to add one more small trouble to the pile that we've just collected here. We talked about resilience and the end of the efficient world, the necessary investments in that. Where does that leave emerging markets and small and medium enterprises that can't afford to invest at scale in an era where we're demanding greater investment?
Well, I think emerging markets, there are a lot of them which are facing challenges, and Gita can talk more about that. But fundamentally, those who have enough foreign exchange, there's capital flight because of high interest rates, they're not able to buy food or fuel, and you've seen the problems in some. So I think there are at least 50, 60, 70 countries with that. But there are also other countries that are in better shape. India is a strong balance sheet. It has strong foreign exchange reserves because of the services export and the remittances of Indians from abroad. Obviously, the countries that have commodities will benefit from China's opening up and so on. So I think it's a mixed bag. So I think we have to go deeper into emerging markets than look at them all as one set. But I think one point I want to leave is, I'm sitting between 2 or 3 eminent economists, and I'm just a humble business guy. But this 2% inflation is a mirage. Because why should inflation ever go back to 2%? It was 2% when there was infinite capital, zero interest rate, efficient markets, no fragmentation, no decarbonization, no resilience. Now you got to have resilience that costs money, decarbonization costs money, geofragmentation costs money, squeezing the money out of the system costs money. So then why should the steady state inflation ever come back to 2%? I don't know. These are eminent people. So why? Who's stuck with this? What is this mirage? What? Huh? What, Gita?
Nandan, I think you need a 101 on what determines inflation. Okay. I'm sorry.
Why? It's become more costly than...
No. We always have a world when there are pressures, cost pressures, and there are demand pressures, and there are many sources of it, right? As long as you believe that monetary policy has control over the nominal unit of account, which is money, you should be able to get the inflation level you want. So what that means, what you're telling me is we're going to live in a world where output is going to grow much more slowly, or we may even have lesser amount of output because of all these supply shocks that are hitting the world. But I can still have 2% inflation. So instead of the world growing at, say, 3%, we move to a world which is growing at 1%.
Okay.
But you can still keep inflation down. I think what is true is that the job gets a lot harder because when you have so many shocks hitting, policymakers don't have a perfect lens. They can't see exactly, I know that's a supply shock and that's a demand shock, and I'm going to magically get it just right. Demand and supply line, we can perfectly hit the equilibrium. So they're going to miss. But there's nothing inherently difficult about getting to an inflation target. Now, what that means actually is that bringing down inflation from high levels is actually, though, easier than bringing it up to a particular level, which is what some of the world has struggled with because there are constraints on what monetary policy can do. But now we're getting a graduate level inflation.
No,
but we just
let's
talk
keep it at elementary.
Yes.
So, Martin, should we keep it at 2%?
Okay, there are two different questions.
Yes,
I
there
want to perhaps I can persuade Nandan in a slightly different way. Since the financial crisis, productivity growth in the major developed countries, also in China, has fallen dramatically. That is a negative supply shock, a massive negative supply shock. We all recognize the GDP of the world has correspondingly grown more slowly than we would have expected in those wonderful boom years. And as you pointed out, the great problem monetary policy makers had throughout their period was not keeping inflation down. It was trying to keep it above zero. And the point is, whether or not you have difficulty in getting inflation, which is the change of prices in aggregate to any particular level, doesn't depend on how slow or fast supply growth is. So what you're saying is that a real supply growth in the economy, for all sorts of reasons, world economy will grow more slowly than that. This is really bad because it means people will be poorer. And a lot of the people who will be poorer are people we really want not to be poorer. And that's a very big issue. But central banks, as long as they can control demand, can reduce the rate of growth of nominal demand, if necessary, just a different way, in line with that relatively low growth. So if they want 2% inflation and the real growth in the world economy is now going to be 2%, for the world economy as a whole, if we had one central bank, then the 4% nominal growth is all they can do. And if we could have 4% growth, then it will be 6% nominal. But they can do either. Except when inflation gets so low that we start getting into the liquidity trap, and now it gets we will forget it. But this is how to answer your question, which is the argument against 2 is that it's too low, because there are situations we have discovered when we would like real interest rates to be more negative, because we can't get a number, more negative than is easy to get when interest rates are zero. So basically, with 2% inflation, that's -2, and if you can only get to 1% inflation, it's -1, and that could be just not enough. So central banks have had to invent all sorts of other tools like QE and so forth to extend this. And the more developed lecture will come from Gita. But the point is, this is why 2% inflation has turned out to be problematic. So if I were designing the system from scratch now, and Olivier Blanchard has written a very good piece on it, you'd probably say maybe 3% would be sensible. Give us a bit more room. I think going much above that gets a bit problematic, because 4% is high enough for people really to notice. Mm-hmm. And if people notice that regularly, then they get very alert and worried about inflation. Don't want that. So let's say 3%. The problem is, one, The real problem is, well, if every time things get a little bit difficult, you change the inflation target, it's going to be difficult all the time. And some people will then say, well, they can say it's 3%, but maybe it's going to be 5% or 6%. And just recently it was 9%, by the way, and it was. So that means we can't trust them on anything. And if you can't trust the central banks, then they have a problem. So my instinct is leave it at 2% because the costs of changing it aren't worth having. But there are situations, and if that old situation pre-COVID had gone on forever, I would have said, go ahead, change it. But that's a big debate. And there are certainly good a priori arguments where you might say, because of nominal rigidity, blah, 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 2% is a bit low.
Thank you.
I have never discussed this with Gita. I have no idea what her views are. But maybe as a representative of the IMF, she shouldn't go there.
Right. I do want to make
Martin,
sure.
this is actually very interesting. It takes a PhD in economics for people to appreciate why we think higher inflation is better than lower inflation. 3% is better than 2%.
Well, you know the argument as well as I do.
Yes.
Let's bring the audience into the argument because, we have fists flying. We might as well bring more on. So who has a question and please.
And they introduce themselves.
Yes. And please introduce yourself.
Yes, good evening. My name is Philippe Monnier. I am from Switzerland. I represent several Swiss organizations. I have a question to Mr. Wolf. What is your? How do you see the future of China, in particular regarding the opening of the country? I would say economic opening of the country.
So, what is it? A riddle wrapped up in an enigma is the famous remark, if I remember, of another great power. So we've heard. Well, first of all, the opening is a remarkable development, given how fast it's happened and how complete it's been, and the consequences. So to me, it's been a tremendous shock. And I spent quite a bit of time talking to colleagues who followed China closely and Chinese people who visited. And this is not what was expected. So the lesson I've learned from this is they've decided that the closure was politically, economically, socially intolerable. And I think that probably has wider implications. It's a pure guess that this administration has had a pretty powerful experience with the costs of closure in a very important, because it wasn't just the COVID closure, it meant closing movement of people and had effects on trade. It was a closure. So I think an optimistic view for me, I'm not sure that would be true for American policymakers, would be that the Chinese government has made a statement that they want to be open and they've realized the costs of it. So that's a sort of Deng Xiaoping 2 statement. The second question, which we did discuss, which Liu He discussed actually in his speech and subsequent discussion reinforced, is that from his point of view at least, the Chinese government, including with that, is committed to further liberalization, to the private sector, to a reform package. So there's more than just opening up, it's reigniting the reform process. On that, I would say personally, I'm agnostic because I've heard this before from similar people and it hasn't really happened. But I think, leaving aside completely all the strategic, geopolitical issues connected with China, this at the very least is an indication that this government, this administration, the third term, is committed to engagement and opening and doesn't see a future for China as a closed system. That's very encouraging, though how this will subsequently develop in policy for the economy, to me, remains open question. And finally, and that will depend a lot on the policy of other countries, not least the US, but also others, because it takes two to tango. And so if they're open, they will want and expect others to be open.
Thank you. Other questions? I've got a question here.
Hi, I'm Sanjay Vishwanathan, former Infosys, and it feels great to be back. And I run a conglomerate. We're about 7 billion in size, and we're growing at about, I think, 7-8% in the normal course of times. But one of the things that we're doing now is making a big bet in India. And fundamentally, we're investing in the core sectors of the country that I think will be pillars of that country going forward, like healthcare, education, defense, and so on, where we want to really work with government and enable them to do this. So I'd love to ask the panel, what's your advice to us? I mean, in a situation like this where capital is only going to get more expensive, governments are going to be more risk averse, and consumers are just not going to be buying enough. So should we hold off and wait another few years? Or what's the advice?
I'm going to start with Nandan, who has no experience with governments that are difficult, risk-averse, or challenging.
I think you should just go out and invest. I think I'm very bullish on India for the next 10, 15 years. I think the whole host of things happening which have put the economy on a growth track. And it's only going to get better. So please go and invest. Don't spend too much time thinking about it. I told Mark the same thing too. Yeah.
Any other?
Do you want to add something?
Oh, wow. After that.
She's a skeptic, so.
No. I'm not at all the skeptic. I think, the distance from where India is right now to where it is going to go is still considerable. So there are good high return projects, and everything you mentioned in terms of healthcare and education are clearly very important. So I think those opportunities exist, and if you can get the right kinds of investment in, I think that's great. I don't think the environment of the world has changed in such a way that costs have gone up so much that those kinds of investments are not going to be valuable in terms of a return. I think they're going to be very valuable. What is true that is if you compare India's growth at this point to several other emerging and developing economies, it is at a very healthy place. 6.8% for this fiscal, and we have 6.1% for the next. So it is a growing economy. It's an economy. We saw the headline for China: population fell for the first time. India is a country where the population is continuing to grow, which means the labor force will grow. There's been, at least in terms of digital public infrastructure, I think Nandan deserves a hell of a lot of credit for that. What's happened in India has been huge. Even the physical infrastructure, there's been a lot of investment there. Thanks to the digital public infrastructure, I think there's much more formalization of the economy that's happening. And so you actually see that can lead to more productivity in the economy, higher incomes. So, it is a positive outlook. Now, I'm not one of those, everything is hunky-dory. There are, of course, issues that still have to be addressed. There are reforms that are still needed when it comes to land. We still have very low levels of labor force participation in India, especially women. Youth unemployment rates are high. So there are, the labor reforms are also needed. So, the areas that require fixing, but health, education, I think these are good areas to be in.
I suppose my reaction is very, very quick. Where else? The only alternative, given size and growth potential, where else? The alternative is to keep it under a mattress, or more ridiculously, in a bank. Have you looked at real returns on bank deposits recently? And I certainly wouldn't have recommended bonds for a long time. So compared to that, where else?
Richard Fisher used to describe the US dollar as the prettiest horse in the glue factory, but I do think, at least from Bain's perspective, there's just what I think has really changed pre and post COVID is the invested commitment. Things like Apple actually ramping up production there. Now, this is not massive production, but I don't know that 5 years ago anyone would have thought that they could make that move in that time. So I think from the ground up, we also see room for optimism with all of the caveats about where your horse is in line. So other questions? Oh, sorry, Martin, did you want to?
No, I just was thinking about all those obstacles are opportunities.
Yes.
There are reasons why the growth might be much faster still than the 5 or 6% it otherwise will be. So those are opportunities the Indian government could seize if it wanted to.
We have time for one more question. No pressure. It better be the best one. No. Any more questions from the audience before?
Last, Mark Schneider, CEO of Nestle.
Okay.
Mark, you know what's happening around the world.
Yeah, first of all, thank you. This was a super helpful panel to just calibrate the economic prospects and also be sure that we're not subject to delusional thinking about 23 and some of the realities that we're facing. I have a question for Martin Wolf, and that is, if I can put you a little bit on the spot for the UK, not so much for the wider political context, but specifically where you see the economy going in the next 1 or 2 years, and also how the consumer you think is going to be behaving.
I don't think I have anything very anything very novel to say. Assume that the world is going to be the sort of world I expect, a pretty weak 24, and a not fantastic recovery in 23, and a not fantastic recovery. Then the UK will be one of, if not the weakest of the G7 countries. That's the most plausible hypothesis. Lots of political uncertainty, lots of unresolved policy issues, the Brexit disaster unfolding, and so that has to be the central estimate. The only optimism I have is we probably, I always say this, reached peak stupidity. Or should I say past peak stupidity. I'm not sure we can say that about the world as a whole, because there are some spectacular stupidities that can happen. I didn't go into that in the next year. So maybe things will get a little less stupid.
Well, on that note, I think good news is you've come to this fascinating panel, so you're clearly way past peak stupidity. I hear a rumor of some excellent food, which for Davos, other than cubes of cheese and a passing cone of something mysterious, is a fantastic upside. So please stay for those of you who can. And thank you very much to Gita, to Nandan, to Martin. I'm Karen Harris, and thank you for coming.
Great stuff.